India, known for its spices, cricket, Hinglish, ridiculous action flicks, and call centers brave enough to maraud as US governmental bodies. The country has had its fair share of tough times, but looks to be turning a corner recently. Or at least that's what the numbers say. So is that a promising sign for its economy or a distraction from a more worrying problem? Let's find out. An economy in bloom. Recent reports place India's economy as the 5th best economy globally, edging out the UK. For once, the Asian nation comes out on top against the Brits. Unsurprisingly, economic optimists have been quick to dub it the next economic superpower, not to be a killjoy, but you don't become the next economic superpower by trailing in the rankings. The position is enviable, don't be mistaken, but upon crunching the numbers further, a different picture starts to unravel, like the fact that the top 5 emerging economies are leaps and bounds ahead of India in terms of per capita income. However, we'll give India its flowers for how much it's grown in the past few years. Nothing better shows this uptrend than comparing India to the leading economy in Asia, China. The economic history of Asia is the difference between the Chinese and Indian economies. According to the World Bank, India's gross domestic product in 1980 was only around 64% of China's. Fast forward to 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization and India's GDP plummeted to only 28% of their Chinese neighbors. The country would go on to experience rapid economic growth for several years leading up to 2021, but that did little to close the gap on China. If anything, India's GDP fell even further to 17%. Given that China's GDP has always outpaced India's and Japan has the next best economy in Asia, it makes little sense to continue to juxtapose them with India. But there is a reason for this. See, China helps with the bigger picture. I'll show you. If India's economy had kept up with China's from 1980 to date, the country's current GDP would be twice or thrice the value it is today. That is, India's GDP would be worth a mouth-watering $10 trillion compared to its current $3.46 trillion valuation. Suffice it to say that a few years of economic improvements aren't enough to close the gap on continued economic growth spanning over 4 decades. India's trump card. Sure, India's economy may have lost steam during the marathon and stopped to catch its breath several times, but it's got an ace up its sleeves that China hasn't: population. China and India are both insanely populated countries, but the former just about outpaces the latter. However, projections suggest the table's turning sometime around the middle of the current century. Put simply, India is about to outpopulate China. But merely having a lot more people isn't enough to make India an economic superpower. This is real life, not a computer-generated population versus population simulation. India's population growth is a trump card because of the demographics involved. Over 50% of the population is age 25 or less, and 65% fall under 35 years of age. A young population is some cause for joy because it means India's workforce will have sufficient employees for the next 4 decades. This will help the country's GDP compared to an aging economy where the bulk of the current workforce is made up of people nearing retirement age and younger demographics aren't enough to adequately replace them. That is the case for China, whose retirement age is 60 and 50 for men and women respectively. It also doesn't bode well that the workforce is aging faster than babies are being born, so there's a high likelihood that there wouldn't be enough or old enough younger demographics to replace the retirees. A growing infection. Although India's population explosion and their relative youth can be counted as a sign of good things to come, there's a sneaky problem gradually worming its way through the population: unemployment. Reports to the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy some 5 years ago, the unemployment rate in the country was around 5%. However, currently the number sits around 7% to 8%. That might not seem like much, but that minute increase represents several million more who don't have an adequate source of income. The CMIE goes on to show that the labor force participation rate is also regressing. The numbers are down to 40% from 46% in the past 6 years. In less financial speak, that means people who are of working age are less likely to engage in the labor market by working or looking for employment. That is, 6 years ago, 46% of the populace was engaging with the labor market, and now only 40% do. So, You can see why the projections of a ballooning population are a two-edged sword to the Indian economy. On the one hand, you have a young workforce capable of rivaling aging economies for the next several decades. However, if the bulk of the workforce is unwilling to work, you're no different, if not worse off, than an aging population-led economy. When you place the growing unemployment trend under a microscope, you get an even more harrowing picture. The youth unemployment rate in India is at an eye-watering 40%, which is leaps and bounds beyond the overall 7.7% unemployment rate of the entire country. If you add adult women's unemployment rate into the mix, the numbers are even more dire. Potential solutions. One of the simplest ways that India could improve its GDP and lower the unemployment rate is to include more women in the workforce. For perspective, if the female employment rate in the country matched males, there would be 235 million more workers injected into the labor market. That number far exceeds the available workforce in the European Union, and is more than enough for Indians to be employed in every other factory across the whole of Asia. Even the International Monetary Fund believes that the country rebalancing its workforce could grow its wealth by an extra 27%. For such a relatively straightforward solution, it'd be silly to think that the country couldn't have come up with it on its own. But there's a reason for this imbalance. See, in developing economies like India's, women remaining at home is often tied to social status, unlike in the West where it's more the norm. Even then, India is a peculiar case amongst other developing economies. That's because its female labor force participation rate is non-existent compared to other countries with similar income. For example, India shares similar customs to its eastern neighbor Bangladesh. However, for the latter, women's involvement in the workforce is up by 50% since 2005, thanks to a boom in garment manufacturing. And if you go further east, in Vietnam, you'll find that around 3/4 of its women are part of the labor market. However, in India, the factories and industries that boost women's involvement are mostly absent. This isn't due to a lack of willing workers, but an absence of employment opportunities. So, although India's economy is getting lauded for its rapid growth and dethroning of the UK, it's hardly creating jobs for its populace. What's to blame? At the core of India's economic problems is its poor job training and educational system. It's not that India doesn't have decent schools. They do. Local employers just don't rate the schools and their degrees. As such, the bulk of the populace is stuck with degrees that might only make them poorer and not provide any financial reprieve in the future. Demographic data show that only a meager 20% of the populace aged 25 to 34 work in high-skill professions, such as medicine, STEM, and advanced research, with the bulk of the population having vocational education. The government also shares in the blame for its youths being largely uneducated. The Indian government allocates a miserly 2% of its GDP to primary to post-secondary education. For scale, this number is lower than the likes of South Africa and Brazil. But if you think that's as low as it gets, think again. In terms of public health care, the Indian government allocates only 1.3% of its GDP. This puts it in the category of countries with the lowest spending on healthcare. Essentially, India is failing at providing two of the basic necessities required for its growing workforce to flourish: health and know-how. Is it any wonder why more people are less likely to work or seek employment and labor productivity is plummeting? Keep in mind that labor productivity is essential for improving the standard of living of the population. The higher the labor productivity in an economy, the higher the products and services produced for the same amount of relative work. As a result, a higher rate of output means better affordability, as people will be more likely to obtain goods and services at reasonable prices. We can see the effect of India's low labor productivity when we compare the GDP per hour worked among BRICS countries, i.e., Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. India ranks lowest in terms of productivity levels. China's productivity was off to a rapid start in the early 2000s when its technocrats decided to prioritize progress over ethical dilemmas. So say they needed to build a dam across a river, the nearby village that depends on that body of water will be displaced. The villagers may or may not be resettled and compensated, but their concerns and feelings are considered in the rationale for damming the river. Ruthless as that sounds, such strategic decisions have helped the country tremendously and improved the lives of its population. More people are out of poverty thanks to the rapid and sustained economic growth triggered by the ruthlessness of a few technocrats. India, on the other hand, seems to have taken a different route. Key infrastructure, like education, potable water, motorable roads, power, and other public services are sorely missing, which is limiting the growth of its people and economy. Other key factors bugging the Indian economy are declines in fixed capital formation and foreign direct investment. The former has plummeted from 36% to 29% since 2007, while the latter has dropped from 3.6% to 1.4% of the country's GDP. Add to that a growing fiscal deposit, which puts pressure on the government's purse strings. And you start to see why Modi's idea of self-reliance as a means to double the size of the economy to $5 trillion might not be the most convincing course of action. And even if the government were to attempt to correct course right now, a lot of systemic changes would be required to set it right. For example, India has missed several waves of Asian industrialization in the past due to poor infrastructure nationwide. Several foreign and local lines seem to be falling in pleasant places for the country now, but failing to leverage these opportunities and implement reforms across the educational, labor, policymaking, and infrastructural fronts will bring the country no closer to living up to the optimism surrounding its current economic state.